everybody. Thank you for tuning in today to this, our first episode of Storytime. I wanted to have a place where I could give you a little bit more lore about the world of Harrisonia, and I want to start today by telling you a little bit about the history over the last 1,000 years. Before the Dragon Menace, there were many tribes that flourished on this continent. Elves were as one with the living forests of Harrisonia, and dwarves had taken to digging in the southern mountains, where the treasure was wrought from nearly impenetrable stone. The first nation of man was in the swamps, and the vast plains that led to the ocean were fertile farmland, utilized by each of the races. Dragons of this world had existed alongside the nations in peace, keeping mostly to themselves and finding their nests suitable for raising hatchlings. They had little reason to squabble and war amongst themselves. This all would change with the will of the gods. Rise of the Dragon Lords. Tiamat and Bahamut would fight over the true nature of the dragons in this world, and thus set about encouraging dragons to fight amongst themselves. A battle of good dragons versus evil dragons. On the side of Bahamut, there were 3 particularly powerful chromatic dragons that served in his forces admirably. They each hated the fact that they were not in control of their fates, and sought a way to rid themselves from the control of the gods. In their search, they found a way that they could hide their presence and infiltrate the kingdoms of a remote part of the world. After over 1,000 years, these dragons still hold a grip on the kingdoms of Harrisonia. The First War. The dragons took to their separate ways, and each found a nation they would claim as their own. Each did not take over by force, they much preferred to coerce their way into influence. Each had become powerful enough to shift shapes, and use this to their advantage, coming close to the kings of each nation. It is not known by what means each was able to earn the power of the crown as their own, but within a century each had risen to a point they controlled the monarchy. Each, craving more power, sought to burn each other to the ground and take control of the whole continent. The dragons found themselves evenly matched. In power, each wielded an army that could hold its borders. In supply, each had a material that the other needed critically. The forests supplied the lumber, the mountains contained the richest minerals and the best stones for building, and the swamplands acted as a natural filter for seawater to flow inland as clean, drinkable water, filling the aquifers. Finding themselves in need of what the other nations had, the first war came to an uneasy end. The dragons settled in for the long game, biding their time, building their resources, and training their armies. And for a time, the world knew peace. Age of Antite. Men, fleeing the corrupting power of the Black Dragon, abandoned their lands in the swamps and took hold of the peninsula. They were aided by refugees fleeing persecution from the southern mountains and eastern forests as well. These settlers would found the nation that would become Luminox. The dragons had no interest in trading with outsiders, and at the time considered building up ports to be a waste of resources. Humans capitalized on this notion and started mining into the eroding mountain peak they called the Hill. In its depths, they discovered veins of a green crystalline material in abundance. As they processed it, they took note of its anti-magic properties in both weapons and armor, and used their technology and engineering to produce war machines. The dragons eventually noticed a buildup of this formidable force, and many times have tried to bring it down. If they ever got past their self-indulgence and teamed up, the dragons would be unstoppable, but their greed has seen to their defeat countless times on the battlefield. With the foundations of the first major Antite mine, a 4th kingdom rose to prominence, known as the New Kingdom of Men. The Brood Enslavement. Dragons had been a natural part of the ecosystem in this land for as long as history tells, and indeed the dragons who were now in charge had been born of the lineages in these areas. In their early days, they hunted and mated as any dragon would. As time wore on and they sharpened their skills and cunning, they would instead choose to eliminate their mating competition altogether. In this purge, the natural dragons of each area were decimated to scant populations, near extinction. Each dragon had its own methods, but each followed a similar pattern. Males were exterminated, females were allowed to live until breeding age, where they would produce a few clutches of eggs and eventually be killed. Their minds would be manipulated into accepting this fate as their own choice, and they embrace it. This internal struggle has lasted for centuries. The War of Attrition. The humans at Luminox had been amassing great power from both home and their trade abroad with the Northern Isles. When they at last reached a point they felt they could take on the dragons and win, they launched their assault on all 3 great worms at once. The dragons found themselves frustrated at the advances of man and their ability to cancel even their most powerful magics. However, the one weakness of humans the other races could exploit was their short lives. The dragons cut themselves off from the rest of the world at a perpetual stalemate with the humans of Luminox. Humankind was not able to penetrate deep enough into the nations of the Great Worms to inflict any real lasting damage, and found themselves on the defensive, protecting the settlements and farms of the plains. Forced peace. Each nation had been suffering the effects of a siege for well over a century. The humans controlled the middle plains and the best routes for trade, which each country needed desperately to stay alive and thriving. However, the humans were stretched thin and often had to yield to invaders they stood no chance of engaging successfully. Peace was a necessary evil that the dragons were willing to submit to for a time, so an agreement was reached. Each nation had well-honed warriors with decades of training. These elite warriors were armed with magics and materials kept as closely guarded secrets. From these warriors, 12 were selected, 3 from each nation, to serve as arbiter and judge of the land to maintain peace and trade. Through military might, peace would be maintained so that everyone could survive and thrive. The judges took up their oath, "Lest we all end in ruin, we submit to peace." Though the threat of war is constant and skirmishes are fought regularly, this forced peace has lasted nearly 200 years.